Thank you. Wow, thank you for that great introduction, Francesca. And, grazie mille, to Paolo Bocagni for organizing this and for this great set of ideas. I'm here for 5 weeks. It's been a real pleasure to meet with Italian colleagues here. There's a fantastic research team, Alejandro, Aurora, Sara. So I'm really excited to see what the outcome of the new, fantastic ERC-funded project yields. I've been in sociology a long time. I've been doing sociology and immigration work for about 30 years. And I know as a woman I'm supposed to apologize for this, but I'm actually proud. I'm still here. I'm not ashamed. And, but I will say that it's been a while that since I felt excited about an emerging paradigm. And I do think, it's impossible to know, without hindsight, but I do think this emerging homemaking or homing perspective in immigration is a really promising one. That I think, on the one hand, just like the concept of home is so basic, I haven't quite, thought about it, but I think it really kind of gets at the heart of a lot of immigration processes. So, I've prepared this presentation today. It's work in progress. I don't pretend to be a leader in immigrant homemaking, but I'm part of this conversation, and what I'm presenting to you today is from work in progress. Actually, we finished the data collection. It's part of a team project in Los Angeles, and this next year we need to write a book. So I'll be happy to hear any of your comments. The project is called LISLA, the Latinos in South LA project. But first, it's always good to start with a hashtag. You may know we have this sort of vulgarian president who likes to tweet stupid things out, misspellings and whatnot in the middle of the night. And last January, when he tweeted out, we're building the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it, the Huffington Post, this media outlet who has this Latino Voices thing, created this hashtag, and they asked people to respond. Tell us your stories. And you can look at it up online. But basically, I think what this gets at is that claiming home, is a political project, right? In this moment, it's a statement of resistance in this particular moment in the United States and in many other places around the world where deportation, exclusion, detentions has become the strongest impulse. And then below we have a shot of kind of an everyday commercial scene in Los Angeles, from South Los Angeles. And of course we have quotes here from Martin Luther King, Obama, and that's Benito Juarez, Mexico's indigenous president from Oaxaca, who says, the quote that he's known for says something like, respecting the rights of others is peace. But partly I like to put this photo up there also. I don't have many photos today, to give you a sense of how Latino urbanism is transforming the greater city of Los Angeles and other cities. So homemaking is a process that happens not only in the domestic dwelling, but in neighborhoods, in cities, in regions. And another little, I don't know what we call this, little poster that has been circulating that becomes relevant for our project, because South Los Angeles, also known, which has actually been rebranded from South Central Los Angeles, which includes areas like Watts and Compton, has been a much stigmatized and reviled part of the city. In fact, if you visit Los Angeles, you probably won't go to South LA. So part of what we have found in our project is this deep sense of love and pride in this part of the city that has been seen as sort of like a cast-off negative space. Okay, so here's a little diagram from, Castles and Miller, just kind of getting at this being the age of migration. So it's the age of global migration, as everybody in this room knows. And it's not just from south to north. It's from east to west. And it's very multiple directions. Immigrants to the United States are extremely diverse. And they include, Finnish techies and Silicon Valley and South Asian doctors and many different groups. But Mexico remains the #1 source of immigration to the United States by a huge margin, and it's primarily a labor migration. Now, points of destination for Mexican immigrants in the United States have changed. For many years, it was concentrated in the Southwest, our southwestern states, and Chicago. But today, Mexican immigrants go to all 50 states. About 10 years ago, Victor Zuniga and Pierrette Hernandez published, they did a co-edited book on new destinations of Mexican immigrants, many of whom were then going to the south, beginning about 10 years ago, going to places like Atlanta, Georgia, North Carolina, where industries that had once employed African Americans were deliberately recruiting Mexican immigrant workers. And so we do now have this new scholarship by sociologists looking at Black Latino relations, Helen Merrow, Vanessa Rivas, and others. Just to go back to this age of migration, we tend to think of migration as one of, this kind of unbridled circulation and movement. But we really are in this new era of walls, barriers, expulsions, and exclusions. And I think that's part of our backdrop for understanding immigrant homemaking, certainly in the US and elsewhere also. So, in immigration, we don't have a big grand theory of immigration, but these three paradigms, I think, have really prevailed in terms of trying to understand immigration outcomes and dynamics. I'm going to talk briefly about each one of them. I think each one of them has merit. But each one of them also misses something fundamental about immigration as a process of homemaking. So that's what brings all of us together here in this room. And I'll talk more about each one of these. Yeah. So the research questions for our Leafless project, the Latinos in South LA project, ask these simple questions. Basically, how have Latino immigrants made themselves at home in a part of the city that is historically African American, the African American area of Los Angeles, the closest, South LA is the closest LA has to something like Harlem. How do they and their second generation children, now young adults who we interviewed, narrate their experiences, the dynamics, their identities, their hopes and dreams. And then I have a separate project that I'm not going to talk about today, but which I did present on here at Trento. And that's looking at what's happening in public green spaces and public parks and urban community gardens in terms of immigrant placemaking and civic culture. But moving forward, how do we build this paradigm of immigration as a process of homemaking while still staying attentive to race? In the United States, assimilation, our dominant paradigm, really came up in an area where immigrants were seen as integrating into a white American milieu. And what we're trying to do in South LA is understand Latino immigrant integration and Latino immigrant homemaking in Black spaces. So these are these sort of mid-range concepts that have been guiding our project. A long time ago, Doug Massey and other American sociologists introduced the concept of spatial assimilation. The idea there is that immigrants go first to poor inner city neighborhoods. Perhaps they live among African Americans. They live in immigrant enclaves, ethnic enclaves. But then over time, as they do better, they assimilate and move to these white suburbs. Well, today in Los Angeles, there's multiple processes going on simultaneously. So there are immigrants who come to LA, varied immigrants, Latino and Asian alike, who may just go to the suburbs directly. That's not what our project is looking at. Oh, actually here I would like to plug the book of my colleague Jody Agius Vallejo, who wrote a beautiful book called From Barrios to Burbs, really talking about the development of a Mexican-American middle class that does choose to live in the suburbs and who has access to all kinds of class resources. But in our project, as I suggested with that first slide, I'm interested in spatial transformation. How does Latino immigrant homemaking transform not only the domestic sphere, the domestic dwelling, but the city, the neighborhoods at large? A long time ago, also, Chicago School sociologists introduced this idea of ethnic secession, right, which was used as a concept to understand transformations in neighborhoods or businesses that may transition from being, say, owned by Jewish Americans to then being owned by Korean Americans, etc. And the idea was that, well, as a racial ethnic group succeeds, the former one is sort of wiped out, they're disappeared, they're erased. We're playing around with a notion that we've developed from ideas in geography about racial ethnic sedimentation, trying to understand how even as the African American population diminishes in numbers in South LA, it still remains Black identities, cultures, histories, social struggles still remain palpable and important to the project of Latino immigrant homemaking. Place-based identity is another concept. Rather than seeing monolithic racial identity, Black identities or Latino identities, we're really picking up on particular kinds of racial identities that are based in these mega neighborhoods of South LA. And then homemaking, right, as an alternative to either assimilation or transnationalism. I'll get into the study, the voices, the dynamics that we've covered, but I want to return to those three major immigrant paradigms that I just mentioned briefly, starting with assimilation. Now a century-old theoretical paradigm, but still the dominant one in the United States. I've made a typo here, but I actually kept the typo on my slide. It's Robert Park, not Roberto Park. But maybe if he was in the US today, he would be Roberto Park, which could be a Mexican and a Korean name simultaneously. The basic idea of assimilation is a shedding of cultural values, language from the old society, and assimilating or taking on new values and ways in the new society. So, right, the idea that you get the erosion of ethnic identities. So, Robert Park and his colleagues at Chicago School introduced this a long time ago. Chicago was their lab. They were looking at European, largely European, Italian, Slavic, Jewish immigrants in the city of, industrial city of Chicago from about 1880 to 1920s. And as I said, this paradigm, these ideas still continue to have legs. I think it's the dominant paradigm in the section on international migration within the American Sociological Association. Milton Gordon, around the mid-20th century, specified more stages. He specified, oh, there are 7 stages. It's a very linear kind of thing, right? Cultural assimilation comes first. Immigrants shed their culture and language. Then they are structurally assimilated into workplaces and schools. And then finally, this area of friendships, marital relations, families. In our own time, the work of Alejandro Cortes and Ruben Rumbau and Cortes and Min Jo have been really important in American sociology, with Cortes and Jo in 1993 introducing this notion of segmented assimilation, a way of understanding what's happening with the second generation in particular. So they say assimilation isn't necessarily monolithic, but they introduced, importantly, the idea of downward assimilation, where they suggest, especially for second generation Latinos, people like those we have studied in South LA, may assimilate into what they called African American underclass and oppositional cultural frames. But again, importantly, notice the focus on culture and values as the main fulcrum here. Victor Nee and Richard Alba wrote an important book about 12 years ago, suggesting there's not necessarily a linear process of ethnic obliteration to the static mainstream, but rather they suggest the mainstream is changing. The mainstream is absorbing, is adapting and incorporating new elements from immigrant and ethnic culture. And there's many more people I could mention here in the assimilationist framework. The work of Tomas Jimenez, Mary Waters, my colleague that I already mentioned, Jody Agius Vallejo. A lot of this is very scientific, like empiricists, bordering on empiricist sociology. A lot of it is also focused on comparing metrics, comparing how the native-born does in education or in terms of occupation or income with the foreign-born. That's what a lot of the evidence is presented as. Transnationalism, of course, an important paradigm with antecedents in pluralism in sociology, and also in Chicano studies with work on ethnic resilience. Transnationalism comes about, maybe 20 years ago with the acknowledgement, now 30 years ago maybe, with the acknowledgement that while we have new transportation, communication systems, and ease of movement, circulation across borders, I like to tell my students that, like many things, good ideas that sociologists have often come from anthropology, and so it is with transnationalism, with Bosch and with Schiller and Blanc. Roger Rouse, I think an unsung hero of anthropology and transnationalism who doesn't get cited a lot. And I would say in American sociology, the greatest purveyors of transnationalism would be Peggy Levitt's work and Rob Smith's work in his book, Mexican New York. But we could add others, David Fitzgerald's first book, Roger Waldinger's more recent book. I won't dwell too much here because I think, we're all pretty well steeped in transnationalism. And then a third paradigm that I would say is like the one that has like the most dynamism right now in the United States is this emerging paradigm on racialization, crimmigration coming from our colleagues in law and society, and really focused on illegalities. Again, we have to tip our hats to anthropologists like Nicholas de Gianova, who I think was out ahead in front with this work. Historians like May Nye, who wrote this book, really giving us this wonderful history of citizenship in the United States and showing how illegality, starting from 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, has always been a fundamental part of citizenship in the US. And then I'll get to my colleagues here in contemporary sociology. Cecilia Menjivar's 2006 article in AJS offers the concept of liminal legalities, getting us away from the binary of illegality and citizenship and showing us how permanent uncertainty, liminal legalities are now kind of a permanent feature of immigrant societies and legal systems. In 2012, she publishes with Lacey Abrego an article on legal violence, right? Trying to show how these various systems allow people, force people to live in, kind of ongoing violence. Roberto Gonzalez has just published, last year, his book Lives in Limbo, Coming of Age in America, a big study on living, the project of dreamers, right? Youth who live who live in a sort of liminal stage, many of whom do not realize they are illegal until they are about 16 or 17 and thinking about going to college, trying to get a driver's license, trying to get a job, and then realizing they are excluded. Tanya Golash-Boza, who's written an important book, Deported, on immigrant policing and disposable labor, looking at deportation regimes in the context of global crisis. So that's one. And then the book by Edward Tejas and Vilma Ortiz, Generations of Exclusion, a very interesting 3-generation overview of Mexican Americans' experiences, looking at both legal exclusion and racial exclusion for Mexican Americans. So how does the immigrant homemaking perspective differ? I'm just going to ask, do I have till 10:30?
Yeah, you're
Okay, all right.
I advise you.
I'm inspired by ideas actually mostly not from the United States. I don't see colleagues in the United States really focusing on immigrant homemaking. So I'm going to cite some others. Starting with colleagues from University of British Columbia. This one article that I believe is forthcoming or just now published in Social Problems, a study of Chinese immigrant homemaking in Vancouver that really gets at not the labor of labor immigrants, but the labor of making home, right? The home, the work that it takes. Looking at different stages. A book that was originally published in Spanish by colleagues from COLEF, that's the Colegio de la Frontera Norte, probably Mexico's biggest immigration studies center, is one that was led by Rafael Alarcón. And then it was published in English, now available from University of California Press. Interesting empirical study of Mexican immigrants in Los Angeles, where they took 3 groups from 3 different regions who come to LA in different periods. People from Zacatecas arrive in the 70s, they're the most well-established, from Oaxaca in the 80s and 1990s, from Yucatan. And they really look at immigration as a process. So they're less concerned than the assimilationists are in comparing these metrics with native born. And they're really looking at immigrant integration in different modalities, right? It's diverse. One very important finding that I always like to highlight from this book is that nearly all of their Mexican immigrant interviewees said their future, their life project, is in the US, not in Mexico. Only 7 of their 90 interviewees said, oh, I'm going to go home to my rancho, I'm going to go home and buy that taxi and set up a business. That was what we heard for many years, and I think it's one small indicator that the era of transnationalism, at least for Mexican immigrants, is over, or it has palpably changed. So that circulation, human social circulation is, and the goal of going back home for various reasons has changed. Paulo Bocagni gives us a big theoretical overview, kind of the theoretical preface to the ERC project, telling us that immigrant homemaking involves calling attention to the materiality of it, as well as the social realm. Immigrant homemaking involving social relationships, symbols, and this more ephemeral aspect of memories. Very much inspired, I think, by writings in urban sociology and geography. Paulo tells us home is a special kind of relationship with a place. I believe sociology, at least in my country, the United States, sociology has become a very place-absent discipline. So when you read a lot of the immigrant assimilation studies, it's almost like it could happen anywhere. It doesn't matter, Home, immigrant home, is sort of a three-pronged, gives us 3 prongs of immigrant homemaking dimension. It's been about security, which we will see in the Latinos in South LA project, has been very problematic, particularly in an earlier era. So how does immigrant homemaking occur at a place where people do not feel safe? Immigrant homemaking as one about emotional intimacy, and also kind of a sense of local sovereignty, autonomy, control over a particular place. So again, homing, he suggests, is about both about affect, these feelings, and also practices, right? What do people do to make home? And then another Italian colleague who I saw was in the program, who I met on a panel where we were at ISA, is Adriano Cancelliere, who wrote this beautiful study about immigrant homemaking in this very diverse, large condominium, where he talks about homemaking as a process of re-territorialization, at least for men in this condominium, as an anecdote, really, to transnationalism's focus on flow, circulation, and movement. So I'm very taken with his writing here, this thing about migrants imbuing domestic space with their own meanings, memory, right, and materiality, we could add. And some of us were in this special issue that came out that was guest edited by Paolo Bocagni and Andrea Brighenti. And I wrote a piece in here about these urban community gardens. I've now studied these in South LA, but in a previous study I focused on a different part of the city, a more Central American part of the city called Westlake or Pico Union, where I looked at the gardens as sort of these hybrid domestic spaces that allow for both recreation, leisure, but also a way of sort of reinscribing what the city looks like by recreating nature in a way that looks familiar, right? Planting homeland fruits and vegetables and so on. and I see these places as very much these mini zones of autonomy, very small spaces of local sovereignty. But I don't see them as much as I would like to as sites of resistance with a capital R, but more as palliative sanctuaries, right? Places where people can restore themselves. Okay, the Leafless study. The Leafless study is a team project that my colleague Manuel Pastor, who was trained as an economist, and myself led with a very talented group of researchers. I was in charge of the qualitative component, and he did the quantitative component. So the qualitative is up here on the left-hand side. We conducted 100 in-depth audio recorded interviews with residents in 3 neighborhoods of South LA. These included 60 second-generation Latinos. That means people, the children of Latino immigrants who were born and raised or who came as very young children, some were 1.5ers. And we interviewed 40 first-generation Latino immigrants. There were slightly more women than men. We used a semi-structured interview guide, which I will put up part of on the screen in a moment. And the interviews were conducted by myself and 2 art aides, and also 2 Latino graduate students who grew up in Watts and Southgate, who have long histories there. And by 2 other young scholars with whom I will be co-authoring. One of them is Veronica Montes, now an assistant professor at Bryn Mawr, and Walter Thompson Hernandez, who is a new PhD student, but actually a very accomplished photojournalist who's also Blaxican and who's also writing about the experiences of Blaxicans, young people who share African American and Mexican parents. The quantitative component did not include original survey data. It was instead census analysis and mapping of the 3 neighborhoods. I'll show you I'll go through some slides of these maps in a moment. The focus was on really empirically documenting this demographic change, and it's quite stunning in a short period of time. We also conducted, I did not personally do these interviews, there were also 19 interviews with civic leaders, African American and Latino civic leaders, and 25 interviews with African Americans in Watts. This was overseen by Manuel Pastor and some other researchers. We also have, well, I'll get to that in a moment. So here's the interview guide we used. There were basically, 3 simple topics. We had a series of questions asking Latino immigrants, why did you come to South LA? What had you heard about it? What were your initial experiences? How have you seen it transform over time? Some people had been residents for 10 years, some had been there 30 years now. And we also asked, what have your experiences, your relationships been with African American neighbors, teachers, and others? These were largely one-time interviews. The work I did at the parks and the gardens included more participant observation, ethnography, but that was not part of LISLA. I wish it had been, but we had scarce resources. So here's where I'm just going to quickly show some maps. These are the census tracts. How many of you have been to Los Angeles? A number of you have been to LA. So maybe you visited South LA. Chances are probably not. But just to give you your bearings, we like to refer to freeways to orient ourselves. And the 10 freeway is right up there at the north edge. So if you were to drive along that, you would find downtown in that kind of northeastern part. And the beach would, Baywatch, Venice, and all of, that fun stuff would be way over here on the west. This is a large area. It's about 50 square miles with a population approaching 900,000. It is not a super diverse area. It is not one of Verdovec's areas of super diversity. It is largely Latino and African American, with just a few Asian Americans and unambiguous whites. But you can see here how it has changed over time, with the African American population shrinking from 1980, when it was 70%, to the present, where it's less than 30%. And this varies by census tracts, which I'll show in a moment. And as you can see, the Latino segment has gone from being 23% to 63% to actually 89% in one of our study neighborhoods. Pretty radical transformation in about 30 years. So here, these are all maps put together by the data analyst working at the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration, which I should have said earlier is the research study where this study, or where we did this. The dark green here shows the African American population. And you can see already in 1980, the northeastern corner of South LA, which is closest to downtown and closest to what was then, in 1980, vibrant textile sweatshops, a big source of employment for Latinos. And also this part close to, basically this east of here is a very Latino working class neighborhood. That was already beginning to change. And as 1990 goes on, you see fewer African Americans along that eastern corridor. Basically, Latinos are moving into South LA and African Americans are moving further west, and they're moving elsewhere for different reasons. 2000 and 2010. Pretty dramatic transformation. Here's another way of showing it with the concentrations of Latinos. So the darkest brown shows greater than 80% concentration. And again, you see that on the east and the north side. I'll just say my university where I work is USC. We're right up there at pretty much where the 110 and the 10 freeways meet. Increasingly Latino, in the United States, the biggest waves of Latino immigration, Mexican immigration occur in the 1980s and 1990s. And overcrowding in other parts of the cities explains this. But you can see that really the areas that remain most fully African American are further west and this kind of southwest area. And, well, that remain non-Latino are the areas around USC. So a big area to study. So we chose 3 particular neighborhoods. South LA is really just this huge mega neighborhood. So there are particular identities around these places. So on the bottom right-hand corner, you have Watts. Surely you've all heard of Watts. In 1965, Watts burned. We have the same problem with police harassment with African Americans, and particularly young African American men today that we did in 1965. That's sort of what ignited the Watts rebellions or the Watts riots. Watts is today about 70% Latino, 30% African American, and still retains a very strong identity as an African American space. Major organizations here, civic organizations, remain, the exception of one, African American led. Historic South Central Avenue up there in the top right-hand corner was once the cultural mecca for African Americans in Los Angeles. The Dunbar Hotel and Jazz Club in an era when segregation prevailed was a must-stop for, you know, Duke Ellington, Lena Horne, all African-American stars who came. Writers such as W.E.B. Du Bois would stay there. An important church is there. It's still commemorated in the neighborhood with the Jazz Park. But today, historic South Central is 89% Latino. The major street is full of shops selling paletas and quinceañera dresses, and you know, it's a Latino commercial enclave. And then here in the middle is Vermont Square, Vermont Slauson, about 69% Latino. Stronger black influence here. This area is also, most of the Latinos who've gone there are Central American, we have discovered, because they moved really from a more concentrated Central American neighborhood. This is the last photo I'm going to show. I happen to have it in my computer, and I thought I would add it to the presentation since home, and tomorrow we'll hear more about the materiality of home in refugee homemaking from Catherine Broom. But I thought I would include this photo so you can see what some of the housing stock looks like in Watts. Watts is home to 3 big projects, public housing. There are apartment buildings, but this is Los Angeles, and a lot of the housing stock was built initially for industrial, white working class workers, small stucco buildings with little gardens around them. That was the promise of Los Angeles. You can come here, you can work in the factory, but you can still have your own little homestead, your own little garden to tend. And since we're in Italy, I will point out the Italian cypress trees provide the barrier of the home here. The Italianate garden focus was very big in Los Angeles in the earlier part of the century. When people came to Los Angeles, well, Anglo-Americans came to Los Angeles, and they thought, oh, the climate is dry, it's Mediterranean, we can make it look like Italy. And here's a vestige of that. 2 other things I will point out at this home is the big power lines, right? Not that desirable to live next to huge, big electrical power lines, which are probably going to give you cancer. And the bars. The bars are inescapable. The bars on the windows, the locks on the doors was a big part of homes where I went to do my interviews, where there are just multiple locks. Some have porches that have almost like a little bird cage bar, you know, again, speaking to the sense of insecurity. Now, this is a home where I conducted interviews. I've been in this home several times, unlike many of the places where I did interviews. It's owned by a Guatemalan family. It's the second home they've owned in South LA. It's in Watts. They love this home, proud of the children they've raised here. You can see roses in the front. In the back, they've planted all of these tropical fruit trees that remind them of home. They love their neighbors, their Latino and African neighbors, but they know when they go around the block, there's these kind of dodgy, you know, dangerous bus stops and liquor stores, and yeah, you just really, there are places to be avoided just around the corner. Okay, that's a little bit of an introduction. So I'm going to move into the interviews here. What did they tell us? Well, the main storyline we find is a different kind of homemaking in African American neighborhoods between the first generation Latinos and second generation Latinos. I'm not going to read these quotes. You can go ahead and read them, and I've kept this beginning Spanish part so you can know that interview was conducted in Spanish. But the main punchline, the main finding we have is that Both first generation and second generation Latinos told us they feel at home, they love South LA. But the first generation continues to feel or experience greater social distance from African Americans. The second generation told us that they feel African American, that they feel great affinity with African American culture, that African American people and ideas and culture and social struggle are part of who they are. Now, as you could have seen from the maps, Latino immigrants began arriving in the 80s, the 90s, this peak era of migration. And they came because it was crowded in the traditional gateway areas in East LA, in Pico Union. Many of them came to South LA without knowing anything about it. Others came in spite of having heard only negative things about muggings and shootings. The first generation Latinos who came in the 80s and the 90s moved into neighborhoods where there was a lot of violence. This is that period of post-industrialization in Los Angeles when factories that had actually made things were shutting down and going overseas. It was a time of violent crime. There was a big crack cocaine epidemic, a lot of gang violence. And the experiences of these first generation Latinos who moved here in the 1980s and the 1990s reflect that. They came because they didn't know anything about South LA, or they came because they wanted that immigrant dream. I'm not going to say it's an American dream of home ownership. And this was the only place where they could afford to buy a house. So very typically, maybe they succeeded in buying a house, they pulled money together, but it turned out the house was across the street or next door to a crack house. Gunshots during the night, and I did hear many stories of people being caught in the middle of gang battles. And as they live there is a transformation. All the gangs are no longer black or African American. It's not all about the Crips and the Bloods anymore. Increasingly, it's Latino gangs, as the third quote up there suggests. A lot of experiences also with burglary, with home burglaries, with assaults on the street. This first person up here says, oh, we went to church and we came home, everything was gone. They even took the clothes we had hanging to dry on the line. And I love this fourth quote here. This woman said, well, the first thing a Latino does is put up fences. You move in and you put up bars and fences. So that's one of the ways they've changed what the neighborhoods look like. There was palpable, real violence, but I think it's also important to underscore that a lot of Latino immigrants coming from Mexico, from Honduras, from El Salvador, and from Guatemala also brought their own version of anti-black racism with them. Countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico have palpable African influence. There was African slavery on that Atlantic and Yucatan coast. You can go to those countries, and I have interviewed women with African features, yet who distance themselves. The national narratives, particularly I think in El Salvador and Honduras, are really based on this sense of being Spanish mestizo, right? And there's kind of a distancing from indigeneity, from indigenous roots, and especially African roots. So that's also part of the backdrop here. So how do Latino immigrants make home in these conditions? They shut in and they shut out. A great sense, they pretty much tell the story of coming to work and raising their families and having very fond memories of their families. So when I'm interviewing women and men, they talked about family parties, graduations, but mostly which happened in the patio, in the home. This thing about putting up lots of fences. And developing very elaborate spatial mobility strategies for going around town, telling the children, okay, as you go to school, you cannot walk through Martin Luther King Park. You've got to, go way out of your way. It's just not safe. A lot of social distancing from African American neighborhoods. So we heard something like this phrase many times. Nos saludamos nomás. We just say hello. We just say goodbye, which might be a very American way of living with your neighbors also. We also heard this stories of a great sense of freedom. It kind of gets at this sense of control and autonomy in home. Feeling free to do what you wish in your home. And one of them was play your music loud. People who had lived in East LA, more crowded, denser place, thought like, oh, here in Watts, we own our own home, we have a garden, we can have a party, and the ranchera music can be blaring, we can fix cars in the driveway. I've seen ponies in front yards in South LA. And of course, birds, chickens, maybe growing some corn in the front yard together with roses making the rancho. But I want to get to this, again, getting back to the question of race. Even among the first generation, not one monolithic experience. Here are two Salvadoran women I interviewed, and I gave them kind of similar pseudonyms. Zandra Castro arrived in South LA in the mid-'80s, has lived there a good long time now. The whole interview with her, she kept telling me things like, well, South LA is better. There's not so many blacks here anymore. No colorblind racism for this senora. And in fact, she had suffered many microaggressions and I would say macroaggressions, having her gold chains yanked off her neck by African American thieves in the street. She told me the black African American teachers at the schools her children went to were unfair to her children. She claimed the mothers, the African American mothers at the school, had discriminated against her because she had lupus and she had these spots on her skin. She agreed, oh, they're a little nicer now, but that was about it. Then, when we got to talking about her own family, she tells me about her African American son-in-law. So it turns out her Salvadoran daughter in high school met an African American sweetheart. Senora Castro told me, oh, I spent 3 days crying. It took me 3 days to get over it. But eventually her daughter marries this boyfriend. The husband now lives with them. She tells me he is the best. Oh, she just couldn't, like her face totally lit up. She loves him. He's the best son-in-law. He comes by and he greets she and her friends and he knows to say, buenas tardes, ¿cómo están? And every night when Senora Castro goes to sleep, she clutches her 9-year-old granddaughter, the daughter of an African American man, a Blaxican next generation girl. Zenaida Carrillo, another Central American woman from Salvador who came around the same moment, took a different line. She arrived and she wanted her children to be as close as possible with African Americans. In fact, she had to fight the school principal to keep her kids out of bilingual education. She wanted her kids to learn English and she knew the way to do that was for her kids to be with black kids. So she sought out contact and closeness with African Americans. She herself did not speak much English, and she said, yes, the children communicate more with them. She remembered fondly taking her children to the library where African American senior citizens, grandpas and grandmas, would read stories in English to her children. She recalled receiving black parental mentorship. I'm happy to come back to this theme. I know I'm running out of time. Something we heard in a lot of our interviews. In high school, her children were bused out to San Fernando Valley. She opted for these schools, and then they wound up going to top colleges, one to an Ivy League school and one to University of California, premier universities. So I think there's a real diversity of voices, varied experiences. But in general, Latino immigrants came to South LA with strong anti-Black prejudices, and during a time when there was a lot of violence. Over time, as you can see with some of these quotes, some of the first generation African Americans say, well, it's really not like that. Once you're here, you know, it's just like any urban, and we interview people from Mexico City or people from violent cities who had grown up in an urban milieu who said, well, it's just like any city. You've got to watch out for yourself, right? Second generation Latinos raised in South LA, as I already told you, felt greater affinity with African Americans, and some of them have now taken on the project of trying to re-educate their parents. I thought this first quote up here was very astute. This young man said he really sees anti-Black racism among the first generation as kind of an Americanization project. That's what Latino immigrants have to do. As another said, well, the older they are, the more racist they are, and that goes for Latinos and for African Americans. Everybody's grandma's a racist. And the second generation also are proud of their parents. There really is this kind of proud of, you know, what their parents achieved with homemaking, and they kind of excuse them for shutting in and shutting out, saying, well, you know, they're busy working, my parents don't speak English. Many of them have been there 20 years, 30 years, and speak very, very little English, and that's been part of what's kept people separate. Among the second generation, there was conflict, to be sure. There were race riots in high schools when they were growing up. There were people pitted, but in general, they grew up with African American friends, peers in schools, and have this sense of sharedness, like this first quote. We fed them beans, they fed us collard greens. We were in and out of each other's homes. Again, noting the greater preponderance of interracial relationships between African Americans and Latinos. And so we see this, this really place-based racial identity emerging among the second generation Latinos that is very different from what you hear in East LA, right? The tradition, the Mecca of Chicano Mexican American identity. So this young woman said, like, in South LA, you get more of the flavor. You're like kind of more in tune with your African American community. And she sort of was dismissive of Latinos in East LA. She saw them as kind of, you know, just kind of stuck as in being Mexican American, tied to their culture. And there was a very explicit criticism raised by some of the second generation of racist Latinos in other parts of the cities. Like in East LA, the person in the first quote tells us, I know for a fact, if you go to one of the projects in East LA and you're African American and you move in, you're going to have to move out. You are unwelcome there. And then somebody else, who we're calling Pedro Sanchez, here talked about his job at Staples Center. This is this huge kind of entertainment complex. There was a big community labor agreement where they had to hire people from surrounding communities to work there, putting people together. And this young man said, so you have people, you know, like from East LA, from the east side, they're not used to being with African Americans, you know. Yeah, kind of sucks, he said. It's critical of it. And then one young woman went so far as to say that she felt a greater sense of kinship and family with African Americans that she grew up with than she did with her own cousins who live in East LA. She and her sister feel her cousins in East LA are racist, closed-minded. This young woman I mentioned, this is the woman who went to Ivy League college. She went to Penn, actually. And she got an MBA in business, worked in business, but then made the decision to come home and teach math in South LA schools to African American and Latino kids. So this was another theme, this kind of commitment to, place-based commitment to South LA. So just to conclude very quickly, you know, Latino immigrant integration and homemaking here has not been monolithic. It's diverse even within the first generation, as I showed. But one really strong finding is this deep sense of place-based attachment, this love and pride to this particular area of the city. We're charting, you know, how it's changed in terms of houses, neighborhoods, what they look like, the commercial establishments, and yet the ways in which African American sensibilities, histories, practices are still important. Place-based racial identity was particularly strong for the second generation. A very strong finding we have that I didn't talk about in this talk was a very weak civic engagement. Among the vast majority of our interviewees, we asked about this. Most people, you know, knew who was president. They knew something about Martin Luther King. Not everybody knew who was the mayor, who was the city councilman, what are the main organizations. Latinos, there's a big problem with Latino political representation in this particular part of the city. That's another aspect of this project. So what I've highlighted here really is homemaking, I think, as a process which has particular temporal dimensions, racial dimensions, and generational dimensions also. And if you have any interest at all, we've written a popular report based on this study. It doesn't have these homemaking ideas, which I want to write about in the book, but you can just Google Roots and Raíces, and you can see our report, which was published, which is online in fall of 2016. Thank you for being attentive.
Thank you very much, Pierrette, for your very interesting, rich and stimulating lecture. And so now we open to the public, to the debate. And I don't know if we have a microphone. Everybody is interested in make questions and comments, please take on your head.
Well, thank you for the wonderful talk. And I just have a quick, well, it could be a long question, but I'll make it quick. Empirical. I was wondering if you run into a lot of Mexicans really work with keeping that sort of rural, campesino, rancho culture.
Yeah.
Alive. That's connected to my work because I do Western cultures and I've been working with Brazilian migration and how people like take that rodeo culture or whatever. Like I also heard that the whole Western industry in the U.S. is based on Mexican labor and like racehorse trainers have to learn barn Spanish, and so
Yes.
I'm interested. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I look forward to talking with you more about your work. Yes. The rancho is alive. You can come to the city and you can bring the rancho with you in South LA, in part because, as I said, the houses kind of, there's almost a suburban, we call South LA the inner city, but the built environment it's an LA built environment. It's not the vertical environment of the inner city in Chicago or New York. I mentioned already that on several occasions I saw ponies in people's front yards. Usually there's, you know, strict zoning and regulation against this. These were ponies, I believe, that people kept at their house and they took them to the park to have like children take a picture or a little ride on it. Probably not legal, but probably okay in South LA. Most of my work, I'm sort of obsessed with plant culture and plant nature. And so I've written and presented, part of the South LA project is about urban community gardens, which is one manifestation of ranchero culture, right? Growing corn and nopales, and then just growing things like tomatoes and zucchinis, some for sale, some for connection, but also this real tactile connection, rooting yourself with the soil, with the land. That's been really important. Everybody here, I think, has probably heard about Compton, right? Compton became not part of our study, actually. It's just south, it's directly south of Watts. African-American, largely African-American, increasingly Latino area. When you think of Compton, maybe you think of like the rap that came out of Compton in the 90s, a West Coast style. There was a whole bunch of movies about, you know, sort of gang culture in Compton. But there's also stables. There are horse stables in Compton. And one of my interviewees, for example, one of the few women at this particular urban community garden, lives in Watts. And she lives in her little stucco house, but she's living the rancho dream, the ranchera dream. She, at her home, she has birds and all those tropical, you know, fruit trees. She comes to the garden, she walks, she feels perfectly safe walking down the railroad tracks to get to her big plot of land. She's one of the few women there. And then she told me she walks, you know, or drives a little further south to Compton where she keeps a horse. And she goes and rides her horse, which, you know, we don't think of as part of inner city culture. So I think it's because this area is spread out and because it's not as deeply regulated. It has been over-policed, and I think particular people, young brown and black men, are over-policed in these areas. But there's, you know, not so many restrictions on plants and animals.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted if the subprime crisis of 2008 interfered in the process of filmmaking for your interviewees.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Oh, I'm sorry, another question, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that very interesting research and kind of, you know, things which has come out from that research. I'm Prashant, I'm at the Center for the Study of Social Exclusion and Inclusive Policy in India, in Pune. And this kind of, you know, research fits in my, you know, research areas. I just want to know a few things from you. It's really, really, you know, interesting what research you have shared. Number one is what makes the South LA Latinos more assimilative towards African Americans than the East LA Latinos? Or are there any racial or, you know, ethnic differences between the East LA Latinos and the South LA Latinos? Could you throw some light on this? Thank you.
One more question.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. My question is how do external factors, and I'm thinking here of the election of Trump, affect homemaking processes for the activity?
Hi, thank you. I had a methodological question about your way of conducting the interviews, and I wondered if, out of the interest of understanding how Latinos constructed their vision and relation moving to a traditionally African American neighborhood. Did you address this question explicitly? Did you let the narrative come through? Did you try? Was it more direct or indirect? And why? Thank you.
Okay, I have a short memory, so hold it there. Those are 4 really great questions. Thank you. I'm just going to take them in the order they were received. The first question on the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, when so many people in the United States lost their homes, when we know Latinos and African Americans lost their homes at greater rates. So interesting. I wish we had had more resources to do this study, because I think real estate and home ownership itself is a big, I wish we had been able to interview realtors, for example. There are of course African American and Latino realtors working in this particular, it would have been great to get into lenders, but we couldn't do that. So basically we have these, one-time interviews with 100 Latinos. Two patterns that we found, and I still want to do a deep dive in these interview transcripts. It's not a representative sample, first of all, I'll say. But among our 40 first-generation Latino immigrants, we found a number of families who owned multiple homes in South LA. So another way of thinking about the rancho, where you have your family. Mom and dad live here, and one daughter is over here, and maybe one son is just a couple blocks over here. The family I mentioned, the one where the daughter went to Penn and is now a school teacher, when her parents were getting ready to buy their second home, she implored them, don't sell the first home, because I want to come home and take over the mortgage for that one. So that's how they built their family compound. Other elaborate strategies, so a lot of times it is pooling of income. But there were also this kind of luchona, single mom strategies, like one Guatemalan single mother that I interviewed who had just kind of worked herself to the bone, doing various things. Informal sector selling of cosmetics, working in a hospital, working in services, domestic work, going to Tijuana to buy things. This woman owned, was it 4 properties? And she extended her home, and these were income generating properties, and this was also going to be her retirement. Also, she owned another place in Guatemala, but that was not a place to go back to. It was only to visit. She wasn't going to be returning there. But nevertheless, there were, also families who, were still renters after many years. And the one slide I did put up, the one home I showed, the Guatemalan family had lost their first home, and I'm not certain if it was in the 2008 subprime moment, but they managed to land on their feet and buy this home, and they vastly preferred this one. They thought there was a better neighborhood, it was quieter. So I ran into that story several times, but I will need to go back to the interviews to see if they lost the home at that particular moment. Or was it another? Yeah. Los Angeles is very expensive. Real estate is very expensive. Gentrification is a new worry in LA. Even in South LA, but particularly up at that very northernmost area that we showed. Okay, the second question I received in this round was, I think it was about the differences between Latino racial identities in South LA and East LA. But I think you're also asking me, if I understood, why did African Americans go to South LA in the first place, which I never explained here. So this kind of gets at this, this historical dimension. Racial segregation was legal up till the 60s in the United States. And African Americans came to Los Angeles. African Americans also came as migrants, as rural urban migrants from the South, fleeing violence, violent racial violence in the Deep South, but also attracted by industry. And in California, it was largely these World War II plants, right? Munitions, building ships, rubber plants, automobiles, this kind of stuff, that brought African Americans to South LA. And when they arrived, it was these white working class neighborhoods of South LA, places like Watts, Compton, that were seen as, there was white flight out of those. And there are particular moments when this is sped up, like after the Watts riots, the Watts rebellions of 1965, a lot of white Americans who had lived in the vicinity left, and it became more African American. Our study, is focused on South LA, and we're focusing on Latinos in South LA. But just to give you the context, in East LA is truly seen as the Mecca of Chicano, Mexican American identity. Right now, East LA is going through its own gentrification battles. It's very close to downtown. Hipsters, artists, baristas have been coming to East LA. And East LA is putting up a very strong anti-gentrification fight. And in terms of homemaking, another project, not my project, but another project that would be interesting to do right now is looking at sort of Mexican-American return to East LA, a place that's affordable and a place where you can live in a Mexican-American neighborhood with Mexican-American art and restaurants and all kinds of other amenities. But in terms of the identities, I think the narratives we heard from our Latino second generation were pretty stunning. And I do want to also put it in context that Los Angeles is a Mexican city. It's a Latino city. It's probably 48% Mexican origin. So Latinos live in many different neighborhoods. Probably not that many in Beverly Hills, but yeah, for sure, some. Not that many in, LA is still a segregated city, but there are many areas of the city that are recognizably Latino. How will Trump affect this whole homemaking process? I don't know. Our colleagues who are working in the deportation, detention, illegalities paradigm have, there's a lot of effervescent work right there. I would say that is the most effervescent area of study for a reason. But I would like to emphasize that Obama was called our deporter-in-chief. Obama, as wonderful as he was and is, could not do everything. And in fact, we had massive deportations throughout the Obama administration. Now, who was being deported? It was not those Finnish techies. I'm sure there's some of them, or Irish, high-tech people who are working out of status. It was largely Latinos, brown and black-skinned immigrants, and largely men. Now, will this change? It might. But in some other projects, I've written about the sort of racialized and gendered aspects of exclusionary movements. So in an earlier era, in the 90s, it was largely women and children who were targeted. And I think there's a homemaking connection there too. Women and children were targeted as the anchors of permanent settlement communities. So we had particular laws against the accessing of public education or reproductive health, for example. But more recently, the narrative has switched to one where it's largely men, and largely brown men, who are seen as the dangerous. I mean, you saw this with Obama's, speech last year on, the bad hombres. We have to get the bad hombres out. Well, he said that, and looked like the buffoon that he is. But in fact, if you look at the statistics on who was being deported, it was largely men from 10 countries. And my colleague Tanya Golash-Rosa and myself have written an article about this, calling it a gendered racial exclusion, right? Somewhere in 90+% of deportees and detainees have been men from just 10 countries. And it's Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, Brazil is on the list, and several other countries that kind of lead the way. And I can't believe Trump will last for 4 years. Even if Trump was impeached, we have Mike Pence as president. That's not good news. And even if we didn't have those guys, we are still left right now with a largely conservative Republican congressional body, and the narrative on immigration needs to be changed in the United States. You read these polls that most Americans are in favor of some kind of immigrant integration programs, but yet these right-wing populist types like Trump continue to gain votes, much because I think their slogans are so simple. Right. The last question was on methods. I might have the whole, if you're interested, I might have the whole interview guide on my laptop, and we could pull it up on one of our breaks. But these were sensitive questions to ask. So we developed this interview guide, one for the first generation and one for the second generation, as a team project. Basically, Veronica Montes and I developed it, and then we had this wonderful team with, young people born and raised in South LA. We sort of pilot tested it several times, and we tried to leave our questions as open-ended as possible, and all of our questions about relationships with African Americans were left to the concluding part of the last part of the interview guide. Now, these were one-time interviews where we weren't really looking at what people do at relationships as they unfold in real time. But you can see with those two women that I put up there side by side, the kinds of concerns that a lot of liberal Americans would have for what Bonilla Silva has called colorblind racism were not really activated in these interviews. That particular woman, did not soft pedal her anti-black sentiment in that interview.
Thank you. Maybe one last very quick question that was from there or someone else. We have just a few minutes before the coffee break. Okay.
Thank you very much for your lecture.
I have a question about about having access to this community. How is the relation with the community? Was it easy to find people? Certainly, there are so many feelings of insecurity.
Yes.
And I can imagine that you can only reach particular people for their interviews. And also, on the other hand, I would be interested in political. If you have any difficulties in doing research now with the new political situation, so it's kind of the other side. So what are the consequences for you for doing research in this field, in this time?
Yes, thank you. Well, we finished this research before the outcomes of this recent election. Honestly, nobody thought we were going to have that kind of electoral outcome. In terms of getting access, that's a good methodological question, and I did not say at the beginning that this project comes out of the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration at USC. My colleague Manuel Pastor our whole center is very connected with community organizations. It has a very political rather than a theoretical or academic tinge to it. So the center does a lot of work, kind of advocacy research, right? And Latino leaders of some of these coalitions there are several unique black-brown coalitions in South LA. And leaders in conversation have been telling us we need a better sense of understanding who our Latino constituents are. Because yes, there are some Latino leaders, but largely, as I suggested, there's a lot of people are in first generations are pretty much in their own space. Language is one deterrent, and the other is just kind of being involved in the whole immigrant project of making home and paying the bills and so on. What was key to our success in gaining access were our research assistants. So our two Latino graduate students and then Walter Thompson Hernandez were all from South LA. I think as a consequence we oversampled highly educated second generation. But it's interesting, there's always pluses and minuses here. So basically we started with a few people, and kind of snowballed it out. And at the end of every interview I would implore people, do you know somebody, do you have a friend, family member who would also allow me to interview? And then we also offered gift cards. I don't know that was a huge incentive. They were $25 gift cards to a local store, either to Starbucks or Target. And it was interesting. Some people, first generation, would say, Starbucks, I don't know what that is. It gives you a sense of sort of world's free of, you think global brands are everywhere.